All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, like we've done the last few weeks, we'll keep the video and the audio off until the end of the presentation. And then I'll kick everybody up to live mode and we can talk about things a bit. Before we go any further, you see a question here on the screen, and I want you to open up the chat and put your answer to this question in the chat. And that is, what is the difference between training and racing? So this could be kind of your approach to both. It could be, your thought process that you use for both of these, portions of the swimming process. It's kind of an open-ended question, so not really a right or wrong answer. Just want to get you thinking a little bit. So go ahead and toss those into the chat, and then I will pull those up later on. So let's go ahead and get into it here. Obviously, today's talk is training versus racing and what the differences are when looking at these two things. And I want to give you some key things to think about from a perspective of what the differences are, number one, when we can kind of deploy these two different strategies, training being the bulk of the time you spend in the sport and then racing being the smaller chunk of time. And then also, what mental strategies you can take into your training to help have a crossover to racing a little bit more. So that's kind of just the goal for today. And along with those, just putting it on pen to paper, we want to understand how these two things are different. We want to review, when we should race even in training, right? When's that crossover supposed to happen? And what does that look like from a dry land perspective, right? So it's one thing to race, quote unquote, in swimming, but what does that look like from the dry land side of things? Or how can we incorporate more of a racing mindset into that dry land side? So when we look at training, this is just kind of a general graph that shows you what happens as you start to train and in relation to performance, to your fitness, and to fatigue. So you can see a couple things happening here that I really want to point out. Number one, we're calling fitness and performance two different things. So that's something to keep in mind. Sometimes you'll hear an athlete say, I need to really improve my fitness instead of performance. And that's because it's kind of viewed as a separate thing, a separate entity. We can see how fatigue interacts a little bit differently with the variables of fitness and performance and how they fall into this overall process of training. So again, remember, fitness and fatigue, two separate entities. Fitness and performance, two separate entities. And fitness, I want you to think of as the underlying adaptations. So what I mean by that is the things that are happening in your body, your mind, with your nutrition, your sleep, all of that type of stuff, things that are, that underlying cause that eventually lead to a better performance. So an example of that for the water-based side of things could be you performing higher on a test set because we talked about lactate threshold or that anaerobic threshold. Basically, you don't go into an anaerobic state as fast. You're able to perform at a higher level for longer. And that is shown on a test set. It could be a new best set of 5 in squats because we talked in one of the earlier presentations about the value of squat strength and getting up to speed in sprint events. So these are kind of all these other variables that help you perform, but are things that you train in training versus when you're racing. Fatigue, there's 3 types. So there's not just one type of fatigue, and this is where you can start to see some of the differences between the training side of things and the racing side of things. So peripheral is kind of our hydrogen ion buildup. So we talked about that a few sessions ago. When you get that burn in your muscles, that's a form of fatigue starting to set in. So whenever you feel that kind of burn, you almost get that taste in your mouth that, you're feeling like you're pushing things really hard. That is a form of fatigue, and it falls under peripheral fatigue. And then we have central. So central, kind of think of your central system of your body. So it's brain, it's your heart, lungs, things of that nature. They experience a different type of fatigue depending on the activity you're doing. So central fatigue is this, decreased voluntary muscle action capability, which is simply like you really just don't want to do a whole lot. You feel kind of blah. is the best way to describe it. So there's actually some training that can almost affect how vibrant the world seems around you. So central training, for example, when you have central fatigue, for example, with weightlifters, they might get through a very taxing central fatigue session. And honestly, it kind of seems like the world is just in grayscale. Like they stop seeing colors for a little bit. And it's just this decrease in just, voluntary things happening throughout your body because of fatigue. And then the final phase of fatigue is muscle damage. And muscle damage is definitely part of the process. Obviously, if muscle damage gets too great, then there's some negative side of things there that can occur. But muscle damage and repair is part of that training, that fitness process. And then obviously the performance line, that's what I call the show. That's where you go out and try to accomplish everything that you're trying to, achieve in this sport for your career as a swimmer. So those are kind of the different breakdowns of these three lines that we're working with in training. And, you can see how, fatigue definitely drops off, obviously, when you start training at a higher level and you're working on your fitness metrics. And then they almost have to, fitness and fatigue almost start to rise together right before a performance is about to happen. And you can actually see it's pretty interesting on the back end of that performance. So the peak of that performance curve, you see fitness actually starts to drop off again. And you see performance actually starts to go back down again after a high-end performance. So you can kind of think of that curve as like nationals, right? That peak of the curve is where you want to perform at a high level. And then there's actually that drop off afterward, which starts to funnel into this process of the differences between training and racing. If training is happening to this point up here, if you can see my cursor moving up and down, and this is kind of our performance curve, you can see progress actually starts to decline after that performance. So there's kind of a little tidbit of why we have to focus on so many things in training versus maybe just letting it rip every time and going as hard as we can in training. There's all these other variables to consider. I saw we had a couple of people just join, asked you to open up the chat and tell me what you think the differences are between training and racing. They don't have to be any really specific answers, just kind of want to get your thoughts on that. So make sure you open up the chat and do that. The next thing I want to talk about when we look at training is this process of properly loading the body. And this is another key to kind of show you some differences here and what's going on and why we focus on certain things in training and certain balances. So if you start here, you'll see that the body, kind of think of this line. If this line was just straight across, think of the body would just be kind of in a steady state, not really overwhelmed or anything like that, not really showing progress, maybe not really showing any loss either, but just kind of a steady line. After we start to overload the body, so overload could be a new training style. It could be a heavier weight in DRYLAND. It could be coach asking you to hold a faster pace in the water. Your body actually goes into alarm. And it's a naturally occurring thing. This is just how we adapt as humans. So the body, all of a sudden alarms are going off, right? And if I had to guess, this is probably what your first maybe week or first month at SWAC really felt like as an athlete. You might, you show up to a college program after being in a high school program, and there's different expectations, right? That's a stimulus. That's overloading, your mental side of things. There might be a different process for the training or a different intensity because you feel like, all right, I'm out of high school now. I'm a college swimmer. I got to focus on hitting these marks a little bit more, closely than maybe I did as a high school athlete. And so there's this overload that happens, right? And then if we look at this line in relation to performance, there's always going to be a drop right after that overload. And then your body starts to adapt. You start to get used to things a little bit more. Another example of this is your DRYLAND warm-up. The first time I take you through that DRYLAND warm-up on the pool deck, everybody's like, man, this is a warm-up. And then after probably a couple of weeks, you're able to hold a conversation and not have any sort of issues, kind of just going through that process without feeling like you're huffing and puffing and having any sort of issues there. So your body starts to adapt to that overload. And this is where we get this performance to increase, right? We get this kind of balance of, all right, we stress the system. We're starting to develop a kind of an immunity, if you want to look at it that way, to that level of training. And then progress is going to happen. Performance is going to happen. From there, we either enter a couple of different stages. We either enter a plateau where you've kind of gone back to this level line that I talked about at the beginning. You're not really improving, but you're not really decreasing in ability. You're kind of just holding steady. So we have to get ready for another overload stage. Or if we go too far, all of a sudden we hit this kind of overreaching, which is where, that resting heart rate we talked about before. If your resting heart rate's starting to rise, you're starting to feel sick more often, things like that. And then that could go into overtraining if the stimulus or the effect of training is too great. You're not able to adapt to that. So a goal training program will always aim to balance stress and recovery, right? That's always the goal. We want to stress the system, and then we want to let the system recover. And then there also might be some small bouts of this overreaching phase. There's some research that if you kind of push a little bit harder for a while and then really pull back, you have what we call a super compensation phase, which essentially means you get this bump in performance out of nowhere. You kind of go from this kind of deep, dark place to all of a sudden, boom, you have this really big performance increase over time. And that can be timed out as you kind of learn your process. So our goal as coaches is to balance stress and recovery. But here's the thing, right? Final exams happen. Girlfriend, boyfriend breakups happen. Team rifts happen. Performance stress. If you haven't had a breakthrough in a while, you get a little bit stressed if all your teammates are performing at a high level and you haven't had that breakthrough yet. If you had a bad night's sleep because somebody was up playing video games and the light bothered you and things like that. If you did not really stick to your diet, and if depending on resources, right? What are we using to track fatigue? What do we have at our disposal? Is it just simply a resting heart rate, or do we have fancy monitors that are tracking all this stuff? So these are all factors that go into this training stress model. And the reason I point these out is, we have the best intentions as coaches, right? To balance this stress and recovery aspect. But this is all these other factors are where you come in as the athlete and have to take control of this as your process. So one thing I like to point out is final exams are definitely stressful. Obviously, the training kind of drops down there in terms of mandatory training at that point. There's a reason for that. Helping teammates through relationship pieces is a very stressful thing for an athlete. It's something that can weigh on you pretty heavily if you're going through that transition. So, being mindful of that of your teammates and helping them through that process can help the overall team performance levels stay high, even in stressful situations. Being aware, simple things of turning off notifications on your phone when you're sleeping so you don't wake up your roommates. All of that type of stuff plays into the role of being able to balance what we're throwing at you in the pool and on land. So keeping that in mind. And what it all comes down to is honestly, it's volume. So volume of stress is what it comes down to. And although swimming stress is one thing, dry land stress is another thing, and life stress is another thing, it's all still kind of goes into this bucket of stress that can tip the scale, so to speak, when it comes to performance. Too much stress leads to that sick, poor performing, overtraining, injury state. And too little, honestly, it's a lack of improvement. And you kind of just feel like, what are we doing? I'm not getting that stimulus I need that is going to help me perform. So those are some things to keep in mind when we look at the training side of the house. And now if we move on to racing is, if we see from training, there's a lot of calculation that goes into it, right? If I go back and kind of went through those charts again, there's a lot that goes into making sure that path is followed correctly. So if we get this nice steady increase here and avoid plateaus and things like that, there's a lot of calculation that goes into that. And then we have racing, right? And racing, I always call it casually calculated because there's strategy, right? You need to know your numbers. You need to know what paces you can hold or you think you can hold, what you've rehearsed, right? So maybe you have not completed a 500 for the whole 500 at a pace of your goal, but you've done a 300 in a set, or you've done 2 300s in a set, and so you kind of know your pacing based off of that. But then the reason I say casually calculated is because then you get into the actual, right? If there's someone next to you and you got a chance to win a national title and it's down to the last little bit, pacing kind of goes out the window. You're going to race the person next to you. If you have a chance to make it back for finals and things like that, yes, you have your strategy so you don't completely blow up and miss some opportunity, but you're also going to do what it takes to get the job done. Or hopefully you have that mindset of, all right, I'm going to go in casually calculated. I'm not going to allow myself to blow up, but if the opportunity is there to do something greater, I'm going to do it. And so that's why these have these little differences throughout training and racing. And so why can't we race all the time? So if we look at this model again that we talked about in the beginning, without even getting into the heavy detail of this model, racing, if we go back to this peak of performance, fitness is starting to be on the decline. So essentially, if we were to try to race and high perform all the time, we wouldn't actually be working on the fitness measures that we need to improve that performance. Yes, you would be simulating a race and you would have some benefit there, but there's not enough stimulus and enough focus on some other fitness variables to get that peak high enough so that you can pull up performance more. So that's why we can't just race all the time. And I think it might have been Eliza who asked, why don't we just go fast all the time? And this is why, because we have to work on all these other variables to drag up that blue line of performance. Racing has very high fatigue, so there's a lot of central fatigue. So if we go back to that talk about the weightlifters not being able to see color after a very high central fatigue session, that's what racing is in swimming. It's that high central. From the moment you're walking up behind the blocks, you're getting into that really heavily stimulated state, more so than if you were just showing up for a Tuesday morning practice in November. So it wears you down more. There's longer recovery times. And honestly, who has made it through a race maintaining form at the highest level for the entire race? And, if I were to ask that question with everybody's video on, you'd probably be like, well, I get about 75% of the way. And then, my elbow position might start to slip a little bit, or I start just kind of slipping through the water, or, right about that 75% mark is where I missed one of my goal intervals, right? So we need to work on things in different scenarios to train that performance posture that we talked about last time. It's one thing to get everything into the right positions and make sure we don't have any restrictions, but then we need to actually rehearse that and build it up to the pacing that we want or that we need. What stroke rate do we need, and what time per 50 do we need to get the job done? And that causes a need for fitness to improve, to pull that number up. So remember, fitness is all those underlying things. Can you hold your breath off the wall past the flags each time? Do you have that lung capacity, or do we need to work on lung capacity specifically and comfort level in an oxygen deprivation state to make that happen? Is that important? When coach asks you to go fast in the water, does that change your stroke? And we're going to talk about that a little bit more as well. What happens when it's time to go fast? Are you doing the same type of stroke as if you were warming up? And so you can see now we have this nice little gap forming between the difference between training and what racing is. So when should we race in training? Because it's one of those things we talk about rehearsal, right? We talk about preparing for the speed bumps as a term I'll use a lot. You want to kind of have some practice runs at this before you just go up and let it rip. And granted, one example I love to use in swimming is if you think back to the first time that you either broke a minute in a 50, or broke 30 seconds, broke a minute in the 100, broke 30 seconds in the 50. It felt like at one point that felt like impossible, for a lot of us. It was one of those things that until you did it, you had no idea you could do it. And that's kind of the interesting thing about racing. So how do we use racing and training to not completely wipe ourselves out, but still provide some value? And this is where you need to shift your mindset to what we call a technical max. So when I say the phrase technical max, what I mean is, what is the best possible form you can maintain at the highest intensity in training. And so if we go back, this is one of the charts that we looked at from one of the previous discussions and kind of the breakdown of intensities. And when we're looking at that anaerobic threshold that we talked about, and you can see here the percentage of time spent, at 108% of anaerobic threshold and things like that is relatively low compared to the overall bulk of training. So it's something to keep in mind that it's kind of these smaller doses, and the mindset is technical max, because now that pulls back into our talk on daily mobility, because we want to make a performance posture. And the performance posture piece of this is doing the right things at a high intensity and doing them the same when you're in that lower controlled intensity. So that's where this whole technical max terms in. So the amount of times that you truly kind of redline it in training are actually pretty minimal, but you work on these kind of technical features where you go as hard as you can within the realm of your technique. And then you keep trying to work on the training piece, that fitness piece, to be able to go a little bit higher intensity for longer, a little bit faster speed without a form breakdown. And the big number for this is 80%. So if you look at someone swimming under 80% of their fastest effort, it is actually a different stroke than when they go over 80% of their best effort. It becomes two separate movements at that 80% number generally. So for you, it might be 75%. For me, it might be 79, but it's kind of right around that 80. The stroke actually becomes a completely different technique. And so our goal is over time, and this is why this technical max piece is so important. The goal is over time to get that 80% number higher. And what I mean by that is right now your 80% is hopefully not what your 80% is going to be in 6 months, because you've been training, you've been improving your fitness. So your 80% in 6 months might be 85% of where you're currently at. But we have to keep in mind that there's this shift that happens. It's a completely different technique under 80% and then over 80%. And you can see how we have to have this technical max approach to make sure we're getting the value we need to out of those high intensity strokes. The best way I've heard it described, honestly, and I think I put it in a slide, earlier in some of these talks, is you want to make hard look easy or hard look manageable. So if you watch, a great sport to kind of compare this to is if you watch Olympic weightlifters. And the reason I like this is because you can honestly track their movement. You can see what's going on from a video standpoint. And if you watch the best in the world go from 60 to 70% to 80% to 90%, the lift does not change. They've gotten so high programmed, high performance posture that it doesn't matter how much weight you put on the bar, that is going to result in the same looking lift. Maybe they won't complete it because it's too heavy, but every mechanic up until that point of failure is going to look the same. You should try to approach swimming with that exact same approach. When it gets up to 81% effort, when it gets up to 85% of your best effort, do you maintain the form that you can at 50% when things are easy and you don't have all these stressors playing a role in your system? So that's how we can bring racing kind of into this training process and try to creep over that 80% threshold and make it look as similar as possible to our easy efforts. Because chances are we're a lot more efficient with our easy efforts than when we get over this 80% number. So as I said, a term we use, you might have heard this term, redlining. If you think about a car, it's when the RPMs kind of go too high or the highest they can possibly go. And honestly, in training, you very rarely do that to the exact distance and cadence and everything that you're trying to do in a race. But you might dance around it. You might do some shorter distances. You might even do slightly longer at a lesser intensity just to build comfort. And so that's why we use this technical max or the technical red line. How far can you push in a controlled environment with plenty of rest? And we also want to space this out on the calendar because, again, if we go back to that thought process on racing, it's super fatiguing, right? So if we do 8 days of racing in a row, eventually that fatigue is going to really skyrocket and the fitness is already starting to decline every time we go out and race. So that's something to keep in mind. And we want to have respect to volume, because volume is the difference between going on a nice steady path of improvement and battling illness and things like that. And again, the ultimate goal is to hardwire performance posture. And honestly, if you took a mantra into this coming season, that's a pretty good one. If you try to think of everything from a posture standpoint, so I know we talked about this a little bit last week with, mobility and things like that, but every time you walk down the stairs, there's a chance to make sure your knee is stabilizing properly, right? Every time you reach down to tie your shoes, that's a hip hinge. There's opportunity to hardwire this performance posture so that swimming, when you go out to swim, it's no big deal. So where do we miss the boat on this transfer of training, and getting and racing in our training? Honestly, I think the biggest one is mental. So at nationals, right? I love to use this example because it's the pinnacle of the season. It's the exciting point of the season. It's everything you've worked for. When it's time to go up behind the blocks, like there's an energy there, right? Well, what about 7 a.m. on a Wednesday in the middle of the season, and you have a sprint set where you're supposed to push? Who's the leader there that's kind of psyching people up and making sure there's a sort of energy about it versus a dread of being there in cold water at 7 a.m. Right? We miss that mental component. We miss that opportunity to really psych ourselves up and get into this more just alert state instead of just kind of being groggy. And then also we miss the boat on hitting our marks. So maybe you have to hold a certain stroke rate. You've tried and true, that's the pace you have to hold, and you don't. Right? We know that information. That information's there. It's not a guessing game. So that's what we have to do. What about breathing? If the goal is to go for 3 breaths and you go for 6, are you really creating that performance posture for when it's time to really go as hard as you can and do the best you can? Same thing with distance underwater. You coming up too early or too late? And also one of the biggest ones I see, especially in like a freestyle event, you can watch elbow position change drastically from the start to the end of the race. So in training, you get the opportunity to really focus on elbow position because it's probably you have more recovery. You also get more exposure to certain intensities to focus on all this on. And so if you can make that change in elbow position less over the course of a race, you're going to be in a lot better position come the end of that race in terms of energy and everything like that. So this is a group, this is a Japanese national team that would have probably been representing their country at the Olympics this year, obviously before everything happened. So I want you to hear, this is their winter training. This is just a video clip of some 25s they were doing from the blocks. I think they did about 8 of these with, probably 3 to 5 minutes rest in between. But obviously you're not going to understand the language or anything like that they're saying, but I want you to just kind of listen to the kind of the mood of what's going on when they're focusing on simulating a race-like environment in their winter training. So I'll play that again. Obviously outside the music, which I always enjoyed, they always played every song under the sun, which was awesome. Listen to the people yelling behind the blocks. Listen to the people kind of getting hyped up and helping the people on the blocks get ready to go. So they actually, a little bit different scenario. This is a national team, right? So they have traveling resources and everything. But there were probably 6 or 8 people behind the blocks, in the stands, things like that, yelling, trying to get them hyped up. And honestly, I mean, if you watch their starts, I really want you to focus on their starts this time. Look how crisp and fast they are off the blocks when that whistle sounds. So as you can see, there's this buildup, right? And that was only a small clip of it. And this process honestly took place for minutes before these intervals started. So you as a teammate, if you're looking to help make this transition from training to racing more, just believable, how many of you have taken the time to really psych someone up, get them ready to go, act like it's actually going to be a walkout at nationals and a chance to go out and try to make it back for the evening session so we can all cheer for you type of deal. So those are kind of the differences where you can make this little bit of a transfer between training and racing and simulate that environment. And it goes back to where, we talked about where we missed the boat. Are you psyching yourselves up, or are you dreading the activity at hand? Are you hitting your marks with the training, or the stroke rate, the breath count, distance underwater, all those variables to make that performance posture? And so that was one thing I really took away from the experience, being able to watch these guys practice and help them on the DRYLAND side a little bit, was there was no wasted effort, right? If it was a chance to go fast, if we go back to when to race in training, right, it's such a small percentage of time where you're really going to push hard. Yes, you're going to work on some fitness things that are equally as difficult for different reasons, but the amount of time you actually get to truly kind of go for it in training is relatively small. So make sure we don't miss the boat with that, and make sure we have that intensity. So now what does this look like from a DRYLAND perspective? And there's a reason we go with these kind of 4-week blocks. Yes, we use the monthly calendar and whatnot, but there's kind of a method to the madness on the 4-week side of things. Usually week 1, you're learning the exercises, right? It might be the first time you've ever experienced this movement, or it might have been a few months ago. Maybe you've kind of grown into it a little bit better through this process. So you need week 1 to kind of learn what we're doing, get a feel for, just what the session feels like. Where is it tough? Where is it a little bit easier? Week 2, you move on to this grow phase. What I mean by that is, all right, we had week 1, we got exposed to the movements. Week 2 is a chance that now, all right, I get to really try to master this movement and make sure everything's where it needs to be. Just because week 1 and week 2 are not kind of a racing environment, if that's what we're, tagging it as here in that comparison, they can still be challenging, because learning is challenging, right? It's tough to learn new things from time to time. So there's a different challenge there. Then week 3 and week 4, you get into this point where you're like, okay, I'm on my 3rd week. I at least have an understanding of what I'm doing. I know what this training session is going to feel like. Now we can start to push a little bit. And when we go back to that linear weight progression that we've talked about, trying to go up by a certain amount of pounds each week, it's usually right about week 3, maybe the end of week 3, where it's going to become difficult, right? You start to feel like, man, I'm not sure if I'm gonna be able to go up by 5 pounds next week. So we hit that point, which sets us up beautifully for our week 4 push, or push plus, as I'll call it, where you're like, all right, this is my race week. This is where I get to really psych everyone up and start to get after it this week on the training. That's not to mean you shouldn't go and try your best week 1, but just based off the flow of the training, it builds into this nice week 4, where we can really hone in on the racing mentality, or the, hey, let's go, let's push ourselves, let's get excited, so we can have that transfer to what we're doing in the water. The nice thing about that, you're spacing it out by every 4 weeks. So we're not getting overwhelmed and doing the same intensity pretty much each week. There's a little bit of a build that happens, and then we start a new cycle of exercises. And again, learning is challenging, but it's a different challenging. And it's also a controlled environment. I'm not asking you to be elite level weightlifters or anything like that, but you're having that progress chain start to happen. So the training mindset, and this is the best way I've ever heard this described, and it really hits home, and I think it'll shed some light on how to approach things. Think of a training mindset as a business person. It's someone who, is going to take some calculated risks, but they're very calculated, right? They're going to do some calculated pushes, things like that. But the goal is to stay on task toward the major goal. We're shooting shots at the right time. So if we're feeling good, we know it's time we can push a little bit. If we're not feeling that great and everybody's getting sick, it's probably time to back it down. We're also adapting to the information we're getting. So maybe we realize that we have to kind of peel back a little bit and focus on form first. So one example of that is, even on the DRYLAND side, I remember Alex had to squat with the TRX for a few weeks just to get that comfort. So we went backwards so we could spring forward then from there. And it's the same thing in the water. We have to adapt to those changes that we're learning. One thing that we thought was best for us might not have been the best, and we have to kind of go back and reprogram. And then Gary Vee, he's a big time marketer and has a big company. He has a quote. It's called "Macro Patience, but Micro Speed." So what I mean by that is, in the long side of things, like swimming is a long season, right? You enter the water in the fall and you don't really get to peel everything back until March. So you have to be patient. You have to be willing to kind of stay on this steady task-driven piece for a long time. But then during the day, you're doing everything in your power to get a little bit better. And so that's kind of this whole business person mentality. It's not going to happen overnight, but you got to keep working toward it on a daily basis to kind of feed that pipeline over time. So if you're putting good stuff into the pipeline, eventually performance is going to happen. If you have too many leaks, like a bad night of sleep, poor diet, things like that, it's just going to slow the time frame that you're going to get to that performance you want to. And then we get into the racing mindset, and that's where you switch to kind of the warrior mentality. So you're tactical, but you're adaptable. You have a plan, but obviously if you're fighting a battle, you have to be able to adapt so you can stay alive and see another day. And that's kind of an intense comparison, but that's what racing is. You go in with a strategy, but at the end of the day, if you need to go a little bit faster to make it back for finals, well, we're going to try to do that, right? We're not just going to accept our strategy if it's not good enough. And you kind of balance this, not showing all your cards, but you got to go win the fight. And what I mean by that is, what paces you need to hold. You probably shouldn't push to this speed, at the beginning of a race, and you got to kind of save some, or, have that steady pace throughout. It's one of those things that, you have to basically have your cards close to your chest, but then at the end of the day, you have to get it done. And you have this survival instinct. There's this fight to it, right? There's this intensity, this tenacity that honestly you have to develop, right? It's not everybody's born with this, and it's something that can be trained through some of these processes we've talked about so far. So how do you do this? How do you cultivate this mindset? And this will be our last slide of today, and then I'll turn everybody on to talk. But it comes down to honestly good teammates and being willing to kind of wear this load of bringing people along with you. So one thing I like to do is say, if I'm training with someone and I know today is a hard training session, it's something I'm like, hey, let's go, come with me, let's go. If I see someone down, I'm trying to pull them along with me, not sacrificing my own training, but I want to bring someone along to challenge me, or I want to challenge that person, because that's when we're going to see that growth. And then that's going to stimulate a racing environment. It might be during a training set, but all of a sudden we've made this little jump of feeling like we're in a race. Another thing you can do is honestly visualize a race before a DRYLAND set. So the one thing I like to do is say, if I'm about to go into a really heavy squat for me, or some sort of challenging interval where I know I have to go really intensely, I might visualize a performance where I did really well in another sport. So for you, it could be swimming, right? You can look back on a positive experience where you performed well, visualize that in your rest interval, and then go up and do the set. And all of a sudden you're getting into this more active mindset. And it's something where you can learn to turn it on a little bit faster than just kind of hope you show up and you're ready to go. You can also use visualization as a separate session. We've done some of that before. I love using it during the recovery side of things. And then these little details will help you take the training and honestly get you to make the gap into a racing environment and have that training transfer to racing. So it takes a little bit of time to kind of learn this, and it's something that's valuable, but it kind of takes this whole system working together to make it happen. So what I'll do now is I will go ahead and turn everybody on, and we'll have a little talk.